At this point, I should probably just start out my video by going ahead and saying that the Russian population is not exactly doing so hot. Yeah, I know, shocker. It's probably so surprising that I am saying this here right now, especially considering that I have made several videos on related topics to this, like literally this year alone. Yes, my friends, what it is that we're going to be doing today here is we're going to be following up with the series of videos that we had done talking about Russia. First, the whole thing with Russian deathonomics as to how that has been affecting their overall economy with their population troubles, and also the whole issue with vodka and that whole history that I did in actually two separate parts, one on the History with Stakuya page and one on the History of Everything podcast, which is my geopolitics page, and how that basically has been wrecking Russia over the course of the 20th and then 21st century. The thing is, when I'm talking about all this, everything that I'm describing, these are merely factors that are contributing to the overall ticking time bomb for the Russian population and state. And that is what it is that I want to focus on. Because I have said for the past several months now at this point that I wanted to start a different series, something that is actually looking at the demographic troubles that people are having all over the world, or I should say, countries are having all over the world, and then examining the history of how it is that they got to that point and why those problems are so severe, whether it is for the countries that have too big of a population that is growing, or the population that is aging and rapidly getting ready to collapse or actively collapsing. But yeah. Oh, and by the way, before we go any further, I've got to share something real quick that is actually kind of helpful for you in between my videos. You know how I'm always traveling for work, so I've said that I tend to play a lot of mobile games. Well, I finally found a way to actually get paid for that time instead of just, wasting it, because I tend to actually kind of do that a lot. There's this app called Cash Giraffe, which is made by this German company called Just Dice. And basically, what it is they pay you real money to go and play mobile games. And I'm not talking about some sketchy, maybe you win a gift card situation or anything like that. This is actually legit. They have paid over $10 million to users every single year. It is something that can actually be helpful for you. So here's how it works. You go and download it. It's completely free. You just give it permission to track your game progress, pick from their list of games. Like I've been playing Mob Control as an example, which is just one of the ones they have on there. This app then tracks your play time and levels, and you earn gems automatically. And then before anyone in here, and I know there's going to be a bunch of things in the comments that ask, yeah, but how do they actually pay you? There's no way that works. Well, it's basically a loyalty rewards thing. Game developers pay Cash Giraffe to try and get real players to try their games, and Cash Giraffe then shares that money with you and me. That's the basic business model. It's like getting paid to beta test games, pretty much, that, you're already having fun. So once it is you hit 30 cents worth of gems, and yeah, that's actually just the straight up minimum, 30 cents, you can then cash out straight to PayPal or Amazon gift cards or whatever, your email. It's that simple, and I really am grateful for them for sponsoring my video in the first place, because it's really kind of a no-brainer. Try it. Click the link down in my description, and you'll actually get 3,999 gems as a welcome bonus right from the start, which is, that's free money before you even start playing your first game. Like seriously, if you're already gaming on your phone, you might as well get something for it, so check it out. Okay, anyway, back to the video. The reason that I'm trying to stress this right here is because the age and makeup of a population affect all corners of life for a state. And in the case of Russia, the demographics are showing an older population that is having too few children to replace those that are dying, combined with a ethnocentric mindset that isn't really allowing immigration to make up for those that are missing. The workforce is something that is shrinking, while the labor market is in a worker shortage. Towns around the country are being abandoned because of better job opportunities and living conditions in major cities, or they're straight up being abandoned of their younger population to go off and die in Ukraine, which is the thing that we talked about with our deathonomics video. Of course, the things that can affect demographics in the modern world tend to be very long trends that compound on each other. So there's never any one single factor or thing, which is also why it's important to be able to address that in kind of chronological order, a history, if you will, exactly what it is that we do. So today, what it is that we're going to be doing in order to tell this story is that we're going to be going back to the turmoil of the 20th century and kind of looking at the demographic changes that occurred within Russia and why it is getting so bad now. This is, as I said before, a kind of sequel or sister episode to the previous ones that we have covered. But again, you need to understand, all of these problems compound with one another, and that is why they deserve so many videos. Ready to start? Let's dive into the details and context. Now, while it is, my friends, that I could go back by many, many, many centuries, potentially even thousands of years, when talking about modern population and demographics trends, there isn't necessarily a need to do this. We do need to go back by a couple, and so that is exactly what we're going to do. For centuries, the Russian state has been seen as essentially a land of endless steppe and a population to fill it. Between the years of 1816 and 1914, the population of Russia would increase by close to 100 million people, peaking at 170 million people around the start of World War I, which was a very big deal. It was seen as essentially a sleeping giant that could swallow the rest of Europe, which had significantly smaller countries, even if they were more industrially advanced. Now, one of the difficulties about comparing the Russian population numbers is dissecting the larger Russian Empire and the future Soviet bloc from Russia itself. Because this 170 million number includes 23 million Ukrainians, 9 million Poles, 7 million Belarusians, and millions of other ethnic groups that now have their own kinds of nations. From the 1905 census of the Russian Empire, there were 67.5 million people in what we now consider the modern borders of Russia. The next census was meant to take place in 1915, but this was then prevented by a little thing called World War One, and that has a tendency to screw everything up, along with the horrible time period that then came after that. Anyway, population. When we were looking at population at this time, the birth rate in Russia has effectively always been higher than average. Even in the 1890s, Russia was unusual for Europe with 50 births per 1,000 people. The average number of births per woman in Russia at that time was 7, which, yes, other places also had high birth rates and would have high birth rates until really going into the mid 1900s. But compared to the rest of the European average, that was typically anywhere between 3 and 5. This is normally something that is attributed to an earlier age of marriage, a lack of birth control, and an agrarian and rural population instead of a more industrial population, as again you would see in the rest of Europe. Of course, the population didn't exactly explode at this time because Russia also simultaneously faced a higher than average death rate of 37 deaths per 1,000 due to the very harsh lives of Russian peasants living on the steppe. Now, the number of deaths started falling before World War I due to better access to modern medicine and the increased availability of new industrial goods, and that did make life easier. But along with that, it also means changes in population. The start of the Russian demographic issues then begins in 1914, with the, of course, as I said here before, beginning of World War I. The casualties of the Great War era are really hard to pin down due to the poor record keeping at the time and the subsequent revolution that would come afterwards, as I said before. And with no way to fully be sure of just how many men were present at the front line and what exactly happened to them, experts now believe the Russian Empire as a whole may have suffered anywhere between 511,000 and 2.4 million men killed in action or that died of their wounds. Millions more were handicapped by their injuries, which is a whole other thing to consider, and the psychological toll is also rarely discussed. It was unimaginable horror. According to a 1924 report from psychiatrist Sergei A., and I'm going to butcher the last name of this here, Priobazinski? We're going to put it up here. He would say, quote, there were 1.5 million veterans who suffered from neurosis, confusion, or had become mentally ill in the proper sense of the term, end quote. These are what we would now refer to as advanced PTSD symptoms. Now, the horrors of war didn't exactly stop when Russia left the war in 1917. That truce with Germany immediately led the Russian Empire into a multi-front civil war. And this conflict's casualty numbers are just as staggering considering that they took place mainly within the Russian Empire itself. The combat deaths alone range from 600,000 to a million upwards, combined on all sides. The documented killings, the terror campaigns, the reprisals, all of that could account for anywhere between another 50,000 to 200,000 deaths as well. We don't know. And that's not even counting potential starvation or any other things that took place in that time. Because those numbers pale in comparison to the civil deaths that are attributed to Spanish flu, cholera, and famine. It is thought that anywhere between 2 to 5 million civilians died by the end of hostilities in 1922, which was then accompanied by mass immigration of another 1 to 2 million people that were fleeing the new communist policies of the Soviet Union. Those events were documented in a September 2022 Russian documentary called Famine, that as of November 2022 was actually banned by the Russian Ministry of Culture. The speculation for this is because it shows American food aid in a positive light, and the Russian ministry doesn't exactly want to demonstrate that Russia is weak. They need to show that Russia is and always has been a great power who never needs to rely on anyone. Which, considering the current issue with Ukraine and how the Russian economy is going, is it's not true. It's definitely not true. But I want to project that. From here, the transition from the Russian Empire to the Soviet Republic was rocky, to say the least. In 1928, the Soviet government under Joseph Stalin would go and implement the first of many 5-year plans, with its focus being the rapid industrialization of Russia and the collectivization of agriculture. One of the main policies of this time was known as dekulakization, which was a policy where Soviets would go and define wealthy or exploitative peasants that were then shipped off to Siberian work camps for their crimes of having any moderate degree of wealth. And this policy alone would lead to between 500,000 and 600,000 deaths, according to the historian Manfred Hildemeyer. They also encouraged workers to move to the cities to help build the new industry for the Soviet Union, to prevent the Western capitalists from invading Russia to suppress the revolution. Now, the downstream effect of these policies was felt almost immediately. The punishment of the most effective farmers would lead to inefficiencies in the growing and movement of crops from the most fertile parts of the Soviet Union, and the other was then a labor shortage of farm workers because they had moved to the cities. As a result of this, the famine that hit the Soviet Union was massive, and over 79 million Soviet citizens were affected by food shortages. Somewhere between 5 to 9 million people would end up dying as a result of this, and some would go on to argue that this famine was specifically targeted at the Ukrainian population in an event known as the Holodomor for their resistance to the Soviet central government. Others would then argue that, oh, it was more of an ideological fight between capitalist landowners and the growing communist state, but regardless of how you want to define it, millions of people would die. And after this, the Soviet Union was able to come out of the famine. The hits to the population just kept on coming. In 1934, Stalin would initiate his Great Purge. This saw the show trial and execution of hundreds of thousands of mainly male conspirators. And total figures are really hard to come by, but it is estimated that during this time, anywhere between 700,000 and 1.2 million Russians likely died. These purges were aimed specifically at ethnic minorities, political enemies within the party, and groups that were considered a threat to the regime, including a large number of Russian military officers. Now, some historians would even go on to argue that the purge of the upper ring of the military is a possible reason as to why Hitler even considered invading Russia when his generals were against this idea in the first place, because Russia was seen as weak and immediately going to collapse. Part of the Great Purge that helped spread the suffering in Russia, though, was the ramp up of the Gulag system. These camps and colonies were made up of political and criminal prisoners. They based the camps around major mining resources and other important industrial areas and could hold as many as 2.5 million Russians at their peak. From 1930 to 1953, roughly 1.5 to 1.7 million prisoners would die in the Gulag system. And of those in the Gulag system, between 70 and 90% were male, depending on the time period. Again, I know that we are going kind of far into the past when talking about this, but I want you to understand the kind of trend that you are seeing time and time again, with millions of people dying. One of the large targets in here for specific strikes being the male population. It's all something that kind of feeds in. And I also want you to understand, and I need to reiterate now, just how hard it is to find the exact numbers around demographics at this time. Because from the poor record keeping to the censorship that was done by the government, the documents can be lacking. You must also account for the addition and subtraction of entire countries depending on the time periods. It is just really messy. According to Statista, the number of Russians in 1940 was around 110 million, which is genuinely remarkable considering all the damage that they had already suffered. But then you remember, oh, well, the Russian population was already producing significantly more children. And so if you can reverse the death rate that you have of children, it means that you still have a population that is producing a lot of kids that are growing up, even if they then get later purged in political issues. So yeah, it's kind of all over the place. But then we get to a little thing that the Russians would call the Great Patriotic War, or World War II. It started out poorly with an invasion of Finland that cost 300,000 casualties, and this was in turn followed up by being invaded by Germany in 1941, which is, yeah, a conflict that has been talked about a few times here on the internet. But the important part for this specific discussion is the 8.7 million military deaths and around 19 million civilian deaths. According to work done after the fall of the Soviet Union, it is believed that of the 27 million Soviet deaths in the war, around 13.9 million of that were from what we consider today to be Russia proper. Like, not the outerlying parts of the Soviet Union, the actual Russians. And as you could probably expect from that, the demographic hit of the war was massive. It is commonly reported that of the male population born in 1923, around 80% of them were killed in the war. According to Mark Harrison, an economics professor at the University of Warwick, the percentage of males that was born in 1923 that didn't make it to 1946 was actually closer to 68%, which still is an absolutely staggering percentage. Of the 3.4 million male children that were born that year, 700,000 likely died during the war. Which, yes, while that is an insane number that is larger than all military deaths suffered by America over the course of World War II, the other part is just as dark. 800,000 children born in 1923 were dead by 1924, and the other 800,000 would die before they turned 18 in 1941. That doesn't mean they died in the war fighting, but because of possibly related reasons, just as civilians. Now, Stack, you may be wondering, why the hell are we talking about all the stuff with Russia in the 1800s and the early 1900s from World War One and World War Two? Why are we going on and on and on and on about all of this? And the answer is because I really need you to understand that being a man in Russia kind of really sucked. Depending on the time that you were born in, you might have genuinely a 50-50 chance of living. This, as you could probably expect, would end up having an effect on the population, and that is what we are trying to focus on here. By the middle of the century, the Russian demographic situation was starting to have issues that we are dealing with here today. Due to the primarily male casualties of all the wars and the conflicts, the gender balance became extremely skewed. In 1950, it was reported that for every 100 women that were in Russia, there were around 77 men. That is a very big problem. This imbalance would lead to a decline in births during the mid 1960s to under 2 million per year before it rebounded slightly going into the 1980s. Because then, of course, you have at least another generation where things start to balance out a little bit. But still, that is a very bad ratio to have, especially when birth rates are going to slow down again. This gap has been something that has been very hard for Russia to fill since the average rate of births by sex in the world is 105 boys to 100 girls. This, of course, ends up balancing out to around 101 men to 100 women by adulthood because men, for a variety of reasons, tend to just die more often, whether that is from disease or whether that is from, I don't know, doing something incredibly stupid, as we're famous for doing. Go figure. But even besides that, another problem that Russia was facing was the astronomical rate of abortions. Now, mind you, when I'm talking about this, and I know that a lot of you are going to look at me and go, Stack, are you getting social political here right now? No, I need you to understand we're talking about a specific historical event and thing that is happening over the course of a time. We're not talking about a lot of abortions relative to a number of population. We're talking about Russia at one point had the highest rate in the world. In 1988, 10 to 20% of all abortions worldwide took place in Russia. That equates to anywhere between 6 and 11 million abortions, depending upon your source. In some regions, like the Central Economic Region of Russia, the rate was 770 abortions for every 1,000 births. Now, these numbers are related to poor understanding and access to modern contraception, but even with access to modern contraception now, the abortion rate is still massive. And that's kind of a crazy thing. According to an article in Foreign Policy, Russia continues to have around 480 abortions per 1,000 births today. Now, while we look at those numbers, we say, hey, that's almost half of what the peak was in 1988. It is still over double the rate that Europe and the United States experience. It is estimated that 930,000 abortions are performed every single year in Russia today. And that, my friends, is just one factor in a long list of factors that we have been going over here to kind of explain why it is that the demographics of Russia have become so incredibly screwed up. Because the reality is, the demographics are a long term, slow problem that very few people are able to address overnight. In fact, it's basically impossible to be able to address overnight because, you need at least, 9 months or so for gestation. That's kind of how it works. The entire Western world has struggled with this, from Japan and Korea in the Far East, with near zero population growth and, in fact, shrinking, to Western Europe's negative natural growth rate. All these countries have similar issues: urban populations, small families, shrinking numbers of young people who can carry on the burdens of society. All of these issues compound on themselves. So the choices that were made in the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, and even older, all of that affect how a country can respond to its demographics today, and that is the context that we had to establish. This can be seen in Russia after the fall of communism, when the demographic time bomb went off for the first time. Known today as the Russian Cross, the birth to death rate in Russia went negative in 1992. Due to the near zero population growth during the post war era, Russia began to experience 10 births per 1,000 people. But at the same time, they were seeing around 15 deaths per 1,000 people, which you can see where there might be a number problem there. The two leading contributors to this phenomenon overall were the dying off of the Great Patriotic War generation, combined with the after effects of the fall of communism, specifically the deregulation of the alcohol industry. Now, this is something that we had gone into here before when I did an entire thing about specifically how alcohol controls Russia and how it's been a problem for the last several hundred years. I did 2 episodes on that, split over 2 different channels. But to follow up on all of that, because some people were wanting more specifics, how can alcoholism be on the same level of an issue as the death of an entire generation, you say? Well, it's always been an issue. To recap what we kind of talked about before, in 1540, Ivan the Terrible would set up the kabaks, the government taverns in major cities. And by 1648, a third of Russian men were in debt to these kabaks. Like a third of Russian men were in debt to the tavern that they would drink at. That's a big deal, both economically and socially. The government of Russia would rely heavily on the taxes that it placed on vodka. In 1859, it accounted for over 40% of government revenue. Even in the industrialized era of the mid 20th century, the Soviet government expected 30% of all of its revenue to come from specifically vodka on average. This is something that would disincentivize the government from addressing consumption. And then when they finally did, it was through harsh treatment programs like conditioned response therapy, essentially a negative reinforcement technique like Pavlov's dog experiments. By the early 2000s, Russia was one of the top alcohol drinking countries in the entire world. And according to The Lancet, in 3 Siberian towns, 52% of deaths of people between the ages of 15 and 54 were the results of complications of alcohol use. If it was men, that percentage was even higher. Along with that, other research would attribute alcohol to as much as 3 million excess deaths from 1987 to 2009, which, genuinely, this rate was astounding. Men were 5 times more likely than someone in the Western Europe region to die from an alcohol related illness, and women were 3 times more likely. Even then, those are crazy numbers, but it still shows that men were way worse off there regarding alcohol. Their findings were that alcohol was responsible for 3/4 of all male deaths in 2006 between the ages of 15 and 54. That is insane. And naturally, of course, this is something that has to be addressed. And there has been some progress in recent years. The Russian government has implemented policies that raise the minimum pricing on vodka and bans the sale of alcohol during certain times to try and prevent access. This would help to at least slow down the tide of alcoholism a bit, and they even attempted to raise the age of purchase from 18 to 21, but this was actually never something that was passed. According to the World Health Organization, these programs have been effective, combined with a general change in the public attitude towards drinking. This would actually result in an 80% drop in alcohol consumption by 2018, according to Veronika Svokotova, which I'm probably butchering the name of here, but that's the Russian health minister. Like, the Russian government knew it was a problem. It always knew that it was a problem. It couldn't really do anything about it for the longest time. And now we have to then go back to the story of the population. If you look at any graph online, you will see that the population of Russia suddenly jumps in 2014. Now, while there was a minor reversal of the birth to death rate, the more accurate answer to what actually happened was the illegal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula and then the break-off regions of Luhansk and Donetsk. The conflict around these actions and the revolution in Ukraine would motivate over 1 million ethnic Russians to flee back into Russia, and that in and of itself would actually lead to a boost in population. Now, while this internationally condemned annexation did in fact make the graph go up, the long term projections did not improve. The population they added to Russia has the same or even worse demographic issues. Ukraine was actually in a worse position than Russia before 2014. According to the Russian Census Bureau, they added around 2.2 million people to the Russian population, but unfortunately, for many demographic problems, many of these people were in the older age brackets. It did, however, also encourage 140,000 people to flee the country that were younger, which made it worse. And so, at the same time, while this was all happening, while Russia was on a demographic leveling off spree, the entire world would then get rocked by the spread of COVID 19. The details of how this affected Russia was that, I mean, I guess it did a lot, but it's kind of hard to really discern because, according to the Kremlin, there were around 387,000 deaths, while other sources like Rollstat would claim more like 820,000 deaths. There's going to be naturally some dispute. They were one of the earliest countries to be affected due to their shared border with China, and their first reported case would happen on January 21st, 2020. Now, while this is something that is an unpleasant conversation to have, yes, people don't really get into this all that much. The COVID virus could have helped alleviate some of the demographic burdens that were being faced by Russia. And again, I know this sounds harsh, but that simple logic, it's real. A disease that greatly affects the elderly and the sick while allowing most young people to escape with very little harm could have, unironically, been a bit of a dark blessing to the state, especially where welfare and pensions and basically everything else like that is involved. That's true regardless. And I know that there's a lot of people who are going to hate that in the comments, but unfortunately, that is just a dark reality of mathematics. But then, then the special 3-day military operation started, and it went on for 4 more years, and is still ongoing at the time that I'm making this. Yes, my friends, the start of the Ukraine special military operation is something that caught a number of people off guard. Al Jazeera would publish an article 15 days before the invasion explaining why the Russian buildup was just a threat and Russia would never invade. And some demographic researchers have their own theory on why the invasion even happened when it did. See, Putin's goals may have been to increase the population for the last 25 years. In a speech that he delivered to school children in Vladivostok in 2021, that kind of laid out his thinking. He told a story of an imaginary Russia that didn't have all the massive population shocks of the last 100 years. He explained that if those didn't happen, the Russian population would be around 500 million, in league with the major players of the 21st century: China, India, the EU, US. So the goal of the war was partially motivated by adding 44 million people to Russia, 96% of whom the Russians would consider ethnic Russians because they believe the Ukrainians are just Russians with other traditions, along the same line as Belarusians. That is at least part of the reason, and there's a lot of other geopolitical stuff that goes into this. But ideologically, if you want to just look at things population wise, that is a factor. This invasion, though, would spur over 900,000 Russians to flee Russia. Now, this alone is a problem, but the specific population that fled were the young and well educated professionals that the Kremlin actually needs to keep the country afloat. This brain drain hit the hardest in the information technology field, where over 50,000 Russian specialists would flee in 2022. Explaining that further, by September of 2022, 600,000 of those who had fled were mobilization eligible, meaning they could have been drafted and put into the military to fight despite whatever it is that they feel, just because of their overall, status, their condition, their demographics. Those who fled and remained out of the country have expressed very little motivation to return to Russia and not be thrown into a meat grinder. Now, before it is that we move on to the next section, there was one part that I did want to address a little bit more. The theory that we were talking about here earlier, where one of the reasons that Putin launched his war in the first place was in order to change Russian demographics, to increase the population. That is something that, of course, is going to get a lot of pushback, but there's several things that kind of support this theory. For one, you have the rampant abduction of Ukrainian children and the brainwashing of these children with Russian propaganda. Now, of course, the scale is hard to nail down because people like President Zelensky will claim upwards of 19,000 Ukrainian children are being held in Russia, while the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry could claim 238,000, and the Russians are, of course, going to deny anything that they're doing this. It's something to where naturally every side is going to claim one kind of thing for horrible crimes on the other or complete innocence, regardless, as I was saying. But if we want to look at things through just data or infer meaning from it, the Russians did in 2022 go and sign a decree, or I should say, Putin signed a decree granting Russian citizenship to Ukrainian children that were adopted by Russian families. And to encourage Russian families to adopt Ukrainian children, they have cash incentives. And early in the war, if the adoption took you over 3 children in your family, it would give you a deferment from mobilization. So yeah, if you were, say, a 28-year-old man married to a 26-year-old woman and you had maybe one child already, you could typically from that go and expand your three-person family to seven people or six people by adopting three more children, and that would get you out of being sent into the meat grinder, which is interesting to say the least. Yeah, this, however, was canceled in 2023 due to the need for new recruits. Because again, meat grinder. What is going on here is a fairly obvious attempt to Russify the abducted children through a series of camps, where they are taught a Russian approved version of culture, history, and society, and that is the end of that for them. Really, my friends, this whole thing is just incredibly dark, but also simultaneously fascinating in the way that it's playing out, because we've never really seen anything like this before in modern warfare. The demographic challenges are showing up in interesting ways in how the war is being prosecuted by both sides. The average age of soldiers in modern wars varies between 18 and 26. When whole nations were mobilized during world wars, the numbers would trend on the higher end of the spectrum. The average age of combatants in the Russian Ukrainian war, though, is between 30 and 42. This is both a symptom of demographics and a cold, calculated choice made by both governments. The Russians have a conscript system that makes all 18-year-olds serve for 2 years. But because they never declared the 3 day military operation to be a war, remember, special military operation is all it is, they legally couldn't send these forces to the front lines in Ukraine, even if they wanted to. This is the youth that they were trying to protect to keep the population growing. Throwing them away in trenches on the front line would be counter to the grand plan. This has in turn led them to try and incentivize the older population to serve through bonuses of millions of rubles, as we talked about here in our video on Russian deathonomics, also with the Russian prison population. For those of you that may not have seen it, to rehash what we talked about in our previous video, the incentives that they are offering are kind of crazy. We're talking 2 to 3 years worth of wages for the average worker to sign up for the military, a higher than average wage while you're in it, and then access to a pension afterwards or death benefits for their entire family. They have pushed local governments to meet quotas of recruits with this system. Because when they tried a limited mobilization of 300,000 Russian reserves in 2023, it was so wildly unpopular with the average Russian citizen that the Kremlin relies on for support, and they couldn't have that. The Russian government learned their lesson from this mobilization and has been focused on outsourcing the fighting to any group that they can on the outer fringes of Russian society. The prison recruitment pipeline would lead to the lowest population of prisoners in the Russian system in decades. Between 150,000 and 180,000 former prisoners were recruited into the Wagner mercenary group and other storm battalions. These forces were then used as assault units with very little care if they actually survived or not, because go figure, they're the dregs of society anyway. And if they die, great, it removes them from the system. If they succeed, great, it aids the war efforts. That's pretty much it. Some of these men would survive and return to Russia, only to go and commit more crimes after being pardoned that then got them sent right back to the front line. These crimes are as severe as a murderer getting pardoned and returning home, killing 13 people in a club fire, signing a new contract pre-trial, and then returning back to the war having never seen the inside of a courtroom. Like, this is actually insane. Shockingly, discussion of the crimes these pardoned veterans are committing is being suppressed by new laws against disparaging the Russian military that carries a 15-year penalty or a first-class ticket to the Storm Battalion. So if you criticize what potentially these former prisoner, now veterans do, you might be joining them. With that being said, the government would end up taking over the prisoner storm battalions after the Wagner Group attempted a coup in 2023, we will say. And also, they did stop issuing pardons that were signed by Putin to prevent headlines of Putin pardoned a Satanist cannibal and such things. That headline refers to one of three convicted cannibals that were pardoned by Putin to fight in Ukraine. To prevent these people from ever returning to Russia, they have upped the contracts from 6 months to 18 months with an automatic renewal. They are mitigating any future damage they may cause after the war by having the military try and get as many of these men killed as possible. And so you may then be asking yourself, all right, why are these men even signing up for a near guaranteed death sentence? Well, a couple factors. There's one, an honor component. They would rather be remembered as a soldier that died on the battlefield than a criminal who wasted away in prison and was executed. But there's also the economic incentives as well. The soldier's death benefit can be a great boost to their poor families in rural communities. In some cases, this is leading to a prosperity jump in the smaller towns and villages, with their young, troubled men at the front line and the death benefits then reaching back into the villages. They are experiencing a rise in safety and economic mobility. According to the Kyiv Post, the death benefits and higher wages are accounting for a third of the Russian military budget. This in turn is elevating people who have been poor for generations into arguably the lower middle class. Besides this, the other ways that Russia is trying to preserve its Slavic core population is to rely on non Slav parts of the population, external recruitment, and some of its allied forces. Now, the casualty figures are sparse, but from funeral reports and newspapers and social media posts, researchers in 2024 put together a list of ethnic minorities and their service in Ukraine. And while the majority of Russian casualties are ethnic Russians, the ethnic minorities are way overrepresented. The Russian ethnic percentage nationally is 80%, but they account for only around 70% of the casualties in Ukraine. Groups like the Buryats, who are a Mongolian ethnic group in southeastern Siberia, represent less than 0.3% of the overall population. But despite that, they are 1.2% of casualties. This is exacerbated by two major reasons: a general lack of economic opportunities, leading to many soldiers signing up for the sign on bonus and the death benefits. And the other major reason is a preference by Moscow to recruit these men first. And what I mean by that is that during the partial mobilization, Moscow Times would go and report that as many as 5,000 men of Buryatia descent were active in the first 24 hours of the mobilization, a full 1% of their entire population in Russia. There were scenes in some villages of men being dragged to recruiting stations in the middle of the night. These men would also then face discrimination in the ranks, where commanders would view them at the same level as basically a prisoner assault squad to be used as they will. The Russians are also simultaneously looking abroad to fill their ranks. According to BBC Russia, there are an estimated 20,000 third country nationals that have joined up. According to the Ukrainian foreign minister, Andriy Sypia, 1,436 individuals from African countries are fighting in the Russian military. The Ukrainians currently hold POWs from 37 different countries, including Nepal, Morocco, Egypt, Brazil, and many others. Now, their motivation for these men is normally money and Russian citizenship. They are reportedly used as expendable assault troops, and in one video, an African fighter can be seen to have an anti tank mine strapped to his chest and then being ordered at gunpoint to assault a Ukrainian position. The Russian who is filming refers to this tactic as, and I quote, using a can opener. But they're not the only ones that don't really have a choice in the matter. The final group the Russians have been able to get to do their fighting caught many off guard when it was first announced. It was North Korea. The North Korean military has deployed around 11,000 to 15,000 troops to help secure the Kursk salient. The North Korean soldiers are on their first major deployment of ground forces since the Korean War. They helped push back the Ukrainians and have held the line in Russia to free up Russian soldiers for other fronts. As of reporting, though, they haven't exactly engaged in direct fighting on Ukrainian soil. They even deployed 5,000 laborers and combat engineers to go and clear minefields and unexploded ordnance. Their casualties are reported to be heavy, though, around 2,000 dead and as many as 6,000 wounded, which, if that is true, that represents over 50% casualty rates, which is horrible. But really, all of this goes to show that these are stopgap measures. And by this point, they're starting to crack a bit. January of 2026 would represent the first month since the start of the conflict that the Russians had more battlefield losses than they were able to recruit. This trend was starting to become known in late 2025, so the Russian Duma passed a bill that would set a rolling call up for the entirety of 2026. It also allowed Russian reserves to be sent outside of Russia to perform special tasks in anti terrorist operations, which you could probably guess what that means. Companies with over 150 workers were being told to choose between 1 and 5 workers to sign contracts with the Russian Defense Ministry. At the same time, they were also finally going after the younger population with recruitment efforts focusing on high school and university students. The goal of this was to directly feed them into specialized drone corps so that they would still be useful on the battlefield, but less in danger than the average frontline soldier. As an example of this, one man by the name of Danil was a student at St. Petersburg University. He had to take a leave of absence and lost his spot in his program, and he was then emailed a year later and was offered to be reinstated to the program. But in order to do this, he would just need to simply do a year of service in the Russian drone corps. Upon his return to university, he was promised free tuition, housing, and admissions for a master's program. He would also receive 6.5 million rubles, almost $90,000 for his 1 year of service. Which honestly, especially if you are serving as a drone operator and you aren't going to necessarily be as much in the way or threatened, sounds like a really sweet deal. And that's what they're trying to do. The Kremlin's attempt back home to keep Russia Russian have also gone to extreme levels. Vladimir Putin has said that the average Russian family would ideally have 3 children. And to encourage this, they have put many new restrictions on their promotion of abortion and what they are calling child free ideology, which includes outlawing any kinds of LGBTQ activism. And along with that, Putin has also put forward a revived Soviet era award for mothers, which is called the Order of Mother Heroine, the highest award that can be given to mothers in Russia. Now, mind you, you may be confused like, okay, hold on. How does a mother get an award? Well, here's what it does. This award gives a 1 million ruble or $13,000 award to any mother who manages to raise 10 children to the age of 1, as in they don't die early in childbirth, and that all are still alive unless they are killed during military service, which that's not going to count. It's not going to be factored into this. That's a lot. 10 children. And guess what? Some people are actually doing it. The first such award was given to Midni Kadyrova, the wife of the head of the Chechen Republic, Razman Kadyrov. As of the time that I am making this video now in mid 2026, it is reported that 67 women have received this award since 2022. Now, that's not a lot, obviously, but typically speaking, if you're going to have something like that and that award is issued, that means it's going to take several more years for people to attempt to do that. So theoretically, 5 to 10 years from now, who knows, that number may jump up from 67 to a couple hundred. Either way, it's something that is a goal for the Russian state, and it's kind of insane. Besides that, though, another insane policy recommendation by the deputy prime minister would include a federal registry that would allow authorities to go and track pregnant women and monitor their demographic situation. The most extreme suggestion has come from a Russian politician by the name of Mikhail Ivanov, which is to ban social media at night, and I'm not kidding about this, to encourage couples to instead do the deed with each other. Because then they're not going to be on their phones scrolling social media. They'll be doing each other. Yeah. The thing is, my friends, even with all of these policy recommendations, the Kremlin's own polling, though, shows that 40% of women of childbearing age don't really still plan to have children in the next 5 years. Many women express fear, depression, and loneliness. The Russian economy is starting to feel the brunt of all of these issues. Its ability to fill positions and train new workers has become a burden that all businesses have to actually face. And then from that, they don't have as many people to actually buy products. According to the Central Bank of Russia governor, Elvira Nabiulina, the country's 2% unemployment rate is leading companies to raise wages, leading to increased production costs and consumer spending power because there, quite frankly, is not enough labor or free labor to be able to keep prices down. They have to pay people more to encourage them to work in the company, and this is leading to just a price spiral. That would in turn cause overall inflation within the Russian economy on top of everything else that they are already experiencing. As of March 2026, they cut their central bank rates to 15%. That was from a record high of 21% in 2024. But even with these cuts, over 73% of Russian businesses report that they are understaffed. What is then happening is the labor market is taking a double hit. The regions that Putin has been pulling from in Siberia to keep the war away from Moscow elites are drawing soldiers from the resource extraction industries. The oil and gas industry in 2021 made up 20% of the entire GDP of Russia and almost half of its federal budget, and it was getting squeezed. In 2024, the number of open positions for oil and gas would rise 24%. They could not be filled. The other side of the hit is the increased focus on Russian heritage that is leading to an increase in xenophobia. According to reports, there have been a 700% increase in hateful rhetoric on Russian social media, which you can take that with whatever you will, with discussion around immigration being overwhelmingly like 84% negative. In the past, Russia would fill these gaps in its labor market with immigrant labor, but the Russian people have become extremely hostile to the point of passing new restrictions into law. This competition for labor is something that hurts both the civilian economy as well as the military, both of which are desperate for people that are not being provided. As stated, the military is starting to struggle getting new recruits. They are forcing companies to name employees to be drafted, while the civilian economy is forced to compete with military wages and signing bonuses. This is something that is stripping labor that is needed for labor intensive jobs like agricultural work and construction. According to the Russian labor minister, Anton Kotyakov, the country is currently facing a labor shortage of 800,000 workers in manufacturing and another 1.5 million in service and construction sectors. This is specifically hitting the military industrial complex of Russia hard. In April of 2026, in Russia, Tatarstan region, a Shahed drone production plant put out a series of job recruitment ads that were aimed at Russian teenagers. The company promised the children wages above the national average. These companies are even having to recruit workers from Africa under false pretenses to try and fill in gaps. Like looking at this, it has gotten so bad that on April 28th, the central bank governor, Elvira Nablina, that I talked about here before, said, and I quote, "What stands out now is the situation in the labor market. In modern Russian history, we really have never lived through such a shortage of workers. We have never had anything like this, and it affects the entire economic situation." End quote. Along with that, the military will also be facing its own long term hurdle that it can't really do anything about with combat. The shrinking of the population will limit the amount of military age males by up to 20%, according to some projection, which is a reduction of almost 2 million men. This drop in available recruits will mean even more competition between the public and the private sectors for high quality candidates, and will also make military actions way riskier because then they will have fewer replacements to draw from. With so many newly motivated neighbors, they will struggle to match the numbers of any one of their major competitors, let alone a two front conflict should anything else happen. These drops, in turn, explain why Russia is blustering so hard over the past several years. They know this is basically a last shot before they will not have the men or the resources to be able to challenge the neighbors at all and fall into a not even a secondary power status, but lower. They may even have to face the threat of their neighbors like China, who is also going through what political theorists call the peaking power trap, where a nation that is seeing its decline coming will lash out in the hopes that it can accomplish its goals before it runs out of time and then the will to actually accomplish them. Thus, as time goes on, Russia is going to see a weakening of their grasp on their sphere of influence. With the value of each soldier going up, they will be less likely to pursue aggressive movements like they did in Georgia and other Caucasus countries. They are already losing some grip on their former sphere. The Central Asian countries that were once reliant primarily on Moscow are instead pursuing a multipolar future, where countries like India and China give them opportunities for trade and growth instead. Because of all this, there is a deep fear in Russia that there will be a loss of Russian culture. It may collapse in on itself. This fear comes from reports that by 2050, there will likely be around 130 million people in Russia, but only 80 to 90 million of them will identify as Russian. Many of these will be of the older generation, which then won't have a younger generation to be able to replace them. Thus, from that, the fear is that this is going to lead to Russia's overall demise. Really, the only way for Russia to reverse its demographic decline would be through embracing immigration at a massive level or fixing its own internal domestic issues to be able to actually produce more children. The immigration side is how America has managed to stay one of the few developed countries to continue its own population growth at a large level going into the 2000s, whereas others have dropped off. This, of course, comes with several other mixed things, but that is the reality from a raw mathematical standpoint. With so many men fighting in Ukraine and so many more women than men, the country can't breed their way out of this conundrum, without polygamy or harems becoming a thing, I guess. But its fear of outsiders is also then leading to anti immigrant rhetoric that we discussed earlier. Around 90% of the current immigrant population in Russia comes from the Central Asian republics of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. And then because these groups are facing so much backlash from Russians, the immigrant population actually decreased in 2026 from 6.3 million people down to 5.7 million foreign born people in Russia. All this to say, Russia is facing massive headwinds. We started 100 years before the current time. Looking out 100 years in the future, the Russian population is going to shrink massively. The UN projects that by 2100, the estimated population is going to go from 146 million people in 2022 down to a population from anywhere between 74 to 112 million people, depending on what kind of things they can change. And even then, the ones that remain are likely going to be much, much, much older. This massive reduction in the population will lead to personal shortages in the economy and the military. These shortages will limit the tax base and decrease the number of people who are of working age. By 2050, it is expected that the working age population will account for less than 50% of the total, which means that pensions, medical costs, consumption, all is going to fall on a smaller and smaller portion of the population. This will be slightly offset by the Russian oil and gas industry, which accounts for 30% of government revenue right now, but it will see a shrinkage in the consumption of taxes that account for the other 70% of government revenue, which is a much bigger loss. The greatest fear is not a slowly dying Russia, but one that ends up fracturing into many smaller nuclear armed nations. The satellite countries that make up the Russian Federation may decide that they don't want to be attached to a sinking ship. This rearrangement of power balance could lead to regional wars or even a full dissolution of Russia that we know today at some point in the future. In closing, my friends, Russia is facing problems that the entire industrial world is also confronting, but on a much, much, much harsher level. An older, shrinking population that isn't having kids. They've tried many of the same policies, from tax breaks and monetary awards for mothers of multiple children to a focus on health and death prevention, etc., that we see elsewhere, and they are doing to extreme levels. But the Russians may have destroyed all the good trends that they were creating by the mid 2010s with their invasion of Ukraine. Now, with a growing casualty count, a wavering economy, and even a more hopeless outlook, many struggle to see how Russia can ever navigate its way out of its current position. That is pretty much it. As for how things are going to end up looking in the future, we can't definitively say, but this is the most likely outcome. Regardless of what ends up happening, though, we definitely will be there in order to tell the story of how it happened. Though I don't know if I'll be alive in 2100. It would be crazy if I am. It also would be crazy if I'm still doing YouTube by that point. But with that, my friends, we're going to go ahead and end things here today. Thank you all very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And I will see you all here next time, my friends. Goodbye, everyone.